Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, letting the noise of the day fade away. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. Let the rain carry you. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that these stories involve real people and real tragedies. We tell them not for entertainment, but to remember those who were lost. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's collection. You are in a safe space here. We leave the waking world behind for the next hour. Tonight, we do not look for fear. We look for the answers that time has already provided. We look for the closing of the book. There is a specific kind of peace found in a solved mystery. The questions have been answered. The shadows have been named. And justice, however long it took, has arrived. It is a feeling similar to reading the final page of a long novel, where the tension dissolves into a quiet certainty. The files we open tonight are old. They smell of dust and faded typewriter ribbon. But they are closed. The verdicts have been read, and the silence has returned to the streets we are about to walk. So, lower the volume until my voice is just a murmur in the background. Let the rain carry you into the quiet. We often believe that our homes are our sanctuaries. We lock the doors to keep the danger out, forgetting that sometimes the wind carries secrets regardless of our precautions. Tonight, we travel to the windswept plains of Amarillo, Texas, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the silence of the night is broken only by the shifting dust. The date is October 26th, 1979. It was a Friday, and the autumn chill was beginning to settle over the Texas panhandle. Amarillo is a place where the sky feels larger than the land. A city defined by its vastness and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the plains. In a modest home on a quiet residential street, Sarah Lawrence had created a world of warmth against that vast backdrop. She was a mother, and on this particular night, her children were asleep in their beds, safe in the heavy slumber of youth. Sarah's husband, David Lawrence, was working late. At 9:30 that evening, he called home. It was a routine check-in, a brief connection across the telephone wires that crisscrossed the dark city. He told Sarah he would be home around 11 o'clock. Her voice on the other end of the line was normal. There was no indication that the sanctuary was about to be breached. The conversation ended, the line went dead, and the clock on the wall continued its steady march toward midnight. When David arrived home at 11:30 p.m., the house was quiet, but it was not the peaceful silence of a sleeping family. It was a heavier silence, the kind that hangs in the air when the rhythm of life has been interrupted. He found Sarah in the living room. The details of what happened in that room are tragic. A sudden storm of violence that had swept through the house while the neighborhood slept. But we recount them tonight, not to dwell on the darkness, but to understand the investigation that would follow. Sarah had been taken from her family. A weapon, a large Bowie knife that usually rested on a rack in the master bedroom, was missing. It was an object of the house, turned against the home itself. David had seen it in its place when he left for work that afternoon at 3 p.m. Now, the rack was empty. The intruder had not brought the weapon with him. He had found it there, a grim crime of opportunity in a house that felt secure. The police arrived swiftly, their lights cutting through the darkness of the Amarillo night. Officers moved through the home with a hushed reverence that tragedy demands. They found a window screen in the master bedroom that had been pulled out at the bottom. It was a small disturbance, a minor breach in the perimeter. But it was enough. Red stains on the windowsill told the story of entry and exit. The sanctity of the home had been broken not by a brute force shattering of the door, but by a quiet slide of metal against metal in the back room. But the night had more to say. Officer Gary Chadwick stepped out of the back door and into the alleyway that ran behind the Lawrence residence. The rain we hear now was not falling then. The ground was receptive, a canvas waiting for a mark. And there, in the dirt of the alley, was a story written in dust. Fresh footprints. They were crisp and clear, leading away from the house and into the deep shadows of the alley. Officer Everett Smith joined the search, his flashlight beam dancing over the ground. They followed the trail. Step by step, the tracks told of a journey taken in haste. The officers noted the specific pattern of the sole, a tennis shoe with a distinct arrangement of dimples. In 1979, the science of shoe print analysis was still developing, but the eyes of these officers were sharp. They followed the dimpled tracks down the alley, past the sleeping houses of neighbors who remained unaware of the tragedy nearby. The footprints led them 2 blocks away. They stopped at an alleyway on 45th Street, directly across from a specific residence. It was the home of a teenager named J. Kelly Pinkerton. Pinkerton was only 17 years old. To the neighborhood, he was just another boy living on the plains. But to the police, he was a known entity, a young man with a history of burglary, experienced in the quiet arts of entering places he did not belong. Officer Smith saw Pinkerton later that night, at 2:30 in the morning. The teenager was awake, and he was wearing tennis shoes. When Officer Smith looked down, he saw the pattern on the soles, a dimpled design that appeared to match the tracks in the alley perfectly. It seemed, in that moment, that the mystery would be solved before the sun rose over the Texas horizon. The path was clear. The evidence was literally stamped into the earth. But justice is rarely a straight line. Despite the footprints, despite the proximity, and despite the history of the young man across the alley, the forensic technology of 1979 was not what it is today. The officers knew what they saw, but proving it in a court of law, beyond a shadow of a doubt, required more than visual similarities in the dirt. There were no measurements taken of the prints in the alley that night. The connection was strong, but it was not unbreakable. A bloody palm print had been lifted from the coffee table next to Sarah. It was a silent witness, a perfect map of the hand that had caused such pain. But in the chaotic days following the crime, the match was not immediately made. The fingerprints were taken, the files were organized. But the connection slipped through the cracks of a system overwhelmed by the volume of paper and the limits of the era. And so J. Kelly Pinkerton was released. The footprints told a story that science was not yet ready to read. The police watched him walk away. The community of Amarillo locked their doors a little tighter. The wind continued to blow across the flat plains, erasing the tracks in the alley. But it could not erase the memory of what had happened. Silence does not mean the story's over. Sometimes It just means the truth is waiting for the seasons to change. We leave the alleyway now, with the footprints fading into the dust. The investigation would slow, but it would not stop. For David Lawrence and his children, the waiting began. It is a specific kind of agony, the waiting. But as we look back from the safety of the present, we know that the wait would have an end. The palm print was waiting in a file. The truth was waiting in the archives. And the restoration of order was simply a matter of time. Let the rain fill the silence for a moment. We will travel forward in time to a spring when the shadows would return, and the law would finally catch up to the footprints in the alley. Spring is a season of renewal, but sometimes old habits return with the change in wind. The breeze that sweeps across the Texas Panhandle carries more than just dust. It carries the memory of what was left unresolved. It was April 9th, 1980, 6 months after the silence had fallen over the Lawrence home, when the stillness of Amarillo was broken once again. The setting was a furniture store, a place that usually smells of cedar, lemon polish, and the dry dust of the plains. It was a quiet showroom filled with empty chairs and silent tables, a mundane backdrop for the daily routine of Sherry Welch. Sherry was 25 years old, a former beauty queen who carried herself with a grace that people in town still remembered. She was working that day, surrounded by the comforts of home that she sold to others, unaware that the shadow from the alleyway had stepped through the door. The events of that afternoon would mirror the tragedy of the autumn before. The investigation would later reveal a haunting similarity in the method. Sherry was found with approximately 30 wounds, a brutality that spoke of a rage identical to the one that had visited Sarah Lawrence. For the police, the connection was no longer a theory. It was a certainty. The shadow was not a ghost. It was a man, and he had struck again. But where the alleyway footprints had offered only questions, the furniture store offered answers. The forensic silence was finally broken. The bloody palm print, which had been lifted from the coffee table in the Lawrence home months earlier, was re-examined. This time, the lines and ridges told a clear story. They matched the hands of J. Kelly Pinkerton. Science, which had been waiting for the technology to catch up, had finally locked the door. The legal journey that followed would cover more miles than most people travel in a year. Due to the intense fear that had gripped the community of Amarillo, where neighbors had begun locking doors that had been open for generations, the trial could not be held in town. Justice would have to be found elsewhere. The proceedings were moved 660 miles away to Corpus Christi. We can imagine that long drive down the spine of Texas, the landscape shifting from the flat, high plains of the Panhandle through the hill country and finally down to the humid air of the coast. It was a journey of distance, but also a journey of time. The miles passed under the wheels, creating a buffer between the violence of the crimes and the sterile order of the courtroom. Pinkerton, who was just 17 when the first crime occurred, seemed to relish the attention. Reports from the time describe a young man who enjoyed the cameras, savoring the spotlight even as the evidence mounted against him. Following a guilty verdict in Corpus Christi, the process repeated itself. Another move, this time to El Paso, for the trial of Sherry Welch. Another change of venue, another long stretch of highway, and another guilty verdict. The dental impressions taken from Pinkerton were matched to bite marks found on Sherry Welch, a clinical and undeniable link that sealed his fate. But time has a way of softening even the hardest edges. By May 15th, 1986, the young burglar who had terrorized a city had become a different man. Jay Pinkerton was 24 years old. He had spent his final years on death row not in rage, but in reflection. He had converted to Islam, finding a structure and a peace that had eluded him in the free world. The execution chamber is a cold place, stripping away the noise of the world until only the essential remains. At 12:25 a.m., the silence of the room was heavy. Pinkerton looked at his father, Gene, who stood on the other side of the glass. There was no defiance left. "Be strong for me," he said, his voice steady in the quiet room. "I want you to know I am at peace with myself and with my God." He recited a prayer, his words drifting into the sterile air. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah. With your praise I ask for forgiveness, and I return unto you." He told his father to say goodbye to his mother. He told him to keep his spirits up. And then the conversation ended. "Goodbye, Jay," his father said. "I love you, Dad," he replied. And then there was only the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. The questions had been answered. The files were closed. The anger that had burned for 7 years faded into a quiet prayer, spoken in a room where the only sound was the hum of the lights and the beating of hearts that would soon carry the burden of memory alone. If they were still here today, Sarah Lawrence would be 66 years old. Sherry Welch would be 60. We can picture them, perhaps sitting on a porch as the sun sets over the Texas horizon, watching the colors fade from orange to purple. But they remain frozen in time, forever young, forever part of the history of Amarillo. The plains of Texas hold many stories, and as the years passed, the heat of the summer brought a different kind of silence to the town of Harker Heights. From the flatlands of the Panhandle, we drift south to a place where the heat rises from the pavement and the nights are long and heavy. Bitterness is often described as a poison we drink, hoping the other person will die. But sometimes, in the strange alchemy of a prison cell, that bitterness transforms into something else entirely. Tonight, we find ourselves in the heat of Central Texas, where the summer sun beats down on the asphalt until the air itself seems to shimmer and bend. It was here, in the small community of Harker Heights, that a routine moment on a quiet Monday would set in motion a years-long meditation on life, death, and the heavy weight of forgiveness. On August 7th, 1978, the town was settling into the slow rhythm of a humid afternoon. Officer Carl Levin, a 31-year-old man known for his dedication to the badge, was patrolling the streets. He was doing what officers do, watching over the quiet neighborhoods, ensuring the safety of the sleeping houses. At the time, he noticed a man entering a vacant property, a structure that stood empty and silent against the vibrant green of the summer grass. It was a simple observation, a check to ensure that the property remained undisturbed. But when Officer Levin stepped out of his vehicle to ask for identification, the silence of the afternoon was shattered. There was no negotiation. There was no warning. The man, later identified as Thomas Andrew Barefoot, drew a .25 caliber pistol. In a single, tragic instant, The future of a 31-year-old officer was erased. The suspect fled the scene, leaving behind a silence far heavier than the one he had found. But the flight would be short-lived. 2 days later, the journey of Thomas Barefoot came to an end at a bus station in Houston. It was a place of transit, of arrivals and departures. But for Barefoot, it was the final stop. The handcuffs clicked shut, and the long, slow wait began. Thomas Barefoot was 37 years old, a drifter who had moved through the systems of Louisiana and Oklahoma like a ghost. He was a man with a history of drifting, of leaving pieces of a fractured life in his wake. But once he was returned to Bell County and charged with capital murder, his drifting days were over. The investigation would reveal a troubled past, a tapestry of arrests and broken laws. But none of that mattered now. Now, he was simply a number in a cell, waiting for a date that kept changing. Time moves differently on death row. It is not measured in hours or minutes, but in the slow drip of appeals and the quiet turning of calendar pages. For Thomas Barefoot, the years between 1978 and 1984 were defined by a series of false starts. He received stays of execution in 1980, then again in 1981, and twice more in 1983. For most, this would be a psychological torture, a pendulum swinging between hope and despair. But Barefoot saw it differently. In the solitude of his cell, he came to believe that these delays were not legal maneuverings, but divine interventions. He told reporters and fellow inmates that God was keeping him alive. By October 1984, the final date was set. The autumn air was beginning to cool, but inside the walls of the prison, the atmosphere was heavy with finality. On October 30th, the routine of the death house began. It is a ritual as old as the system itself, a strange attempt to offer comfort at the very end of the road. Barefoot was granted a final meal, and the specific details of that menu speak to a need for warmth and substance. He requested soup with crackers, chili with beans, steamed rice, seasoned mustard greens, and hot spiced beets. It was a meal of heavy, earthy flavors, washed down with iced tea. We can imagine the steam rising from the chili, the condensation on the glass of tea. A fleeting sensory experience in a world of cold steel and concrete. While he ate, his thoughts turned not to his own fear, but to the people he was leaving behind. He spoke to his fellow prisoners with a calm assurance, telling them, "I'll see you later. I'll be back." It was the statement of a man who had made peace with the inevitable. But his most profound words were reserved for the very end. Shortly after midnight, as the clock ticked over into Halloween, Barefoot was strapped to the gurney. The room was sterile, the witnesses silent. When asked for his final statement, he did not plead for his life. Instead, he offered a sermon on the nature of hate. He spoke directly to the memory of the world he was leaving, and specifically to the widow of Officer Levin. "I hope that one day we can look back on the evil that we're doing right now like the witches we burned at the stake," he said. His voice was steady, devoid of the anger one might expect. "I want everybody to know that I hold nothing against them. I forgive them all." He continued, his words hanging in the air like smoke. "I've been praying all day for Carl Levin's wife to drive the bitterness from her heart, because that bitterness that's in her heart will send her to hell just as surely as any other sin." It was a complex final message, a plea for forgiveness wrapped in a warning. He spoke of bitterness as a weight, a heavy stone that the living are forced to carry long after the dead are gone. He apologized for everything he had ever done, asked for forgiveness, and then, mid-sentence, while saying goodbye to his friends, he stopped. The chemicals took hold. The silence returned. Carl Levin would have been 37 years old that night, the same age Barefoot was when he pulled the trigger years earlier. Today, a park in Harker Heights bears his name. A green space where children play and the wind rustles through the trees, far removed from the tragedy of that August afternoon. Bitterness is a heavy stone to carry, and sometimes it is the innocent who are forced to carry it the furthest. From the quiet parks of Harker Heights, we travel north now, to the sprawling city of Dallas. It is June 1977. The air is thick with the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of a long summer. But in the shade of a local park, a different kind of story was waiting to be written. We often believe that a sanctuary is a place defined by thick walls and heavy doors, a fortress built to keep the chaos of the world at bay. But sometimes, a sanctuary is nothing more than a feeling, a quiet space between two people who have promised to face the future together. On a warm afternoon in June 1977, the city of Dallas was alive with the hum of summer, the air thick with the scent of blooming magnolia and the heat radiating off the pavement. In the Oak Cliff neighborhood, the Sunday sun cast long, lazy shadows across the grass, holding the day in a golden suspension that felt as if it might last forever. Elvira Guerrero and Mario Alvarado Garza were sitting in that golden light, unaware that the shadows were lengthening around them. Elvira, 36 years old, was a woman whose life was defined by a gentle, rhythmic devotion. Earlier that morning, the sound of her fingers moving across the piano keys had filled the Second Mexican Baptist Church, the notes drifting up into the rafters and settling like dust motes in the stained glass light. It was a day of new beginnings. Mario, 28, had been baptized just hours before, the water washing away the past and preparing him for a life they were planning to build together. They had driven to a local park to discuss the details of their upcoming wedding. It was the kind of mundane, beautiful conversation that anchors a life. Talk of guests, of flowers, of a home filled with music. The car windows were rolled down to catch the breeze, and the world outside seemed distant, a backdrop to their shared happiness. They were safe in the sanctuary of their own making, protected by the daylight and the public setting of a city park. But the wind was changing. Two men, Michael Wayne Evans and Earl Stanley Smith, were walking through the park, moving with a purpose that cut through the lazy Sunday atmosphere. They were not there to enjoy the afternoon. They were hunting. To the casual observer, they might have looked like two friends taking a walk. But the intent they carried was heavy, a dark gravity that pulled them toward the couple sitting in the car. The disruption was not loud. It did not announce itself with a scream or a siren. It arrived with the sudden, metallic click of a pistol at the window, shattering the illusion of safety in a single heartbeat. The drive that followed was a journey into a different kind of silence. Smith and Evans forced the couple to drive to a remote area in South Dallas, the city scenery fading into the overgrown quiet of the outskirts. Inside the car, the air must have felt impossibly heavy. charged with the static of fear and the unspoken prayers of two people who had just been planning a celebration. The robbery itself was small, almost trivial in its scope. $40 in church donations and $12 from a wallet. A total of $52, the price placed on the sanctity of that afternoon. They arrived at a hay field, a place where the tall grass swayed in the wind, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding within it. It was here that the true nature of Elvira Guerrero's spirit was revealed. Facing the end, she did not fight in the way we might expect. She did not scream in anger or beg for her life with desperation. According to the confession later given by Evans, she reached out. She took the hand of the man who was about to end her life, looked into his eyes, and did the only thing she knew how to do. She prayed. "God help him," she whispered. "God help him." It was a moment of grace that defies understanding. In the face of absolute darkness, she offered a light so blindingly pure that it seemed to confuse even the men holding the weapons. She was not praying for herself. She was praying for the souls of the men who were taking her away from the world. The violence that followed was brutal, a sharp and jagged end to a day that had begun with piano music and baptismal water. But the memory of that prayer lingered long after the sound of the gunshots had faded into the wind. The men covered the bodies with hay and bushes, letting the landscape reclaim the scene. They took the car, they took the watch, and they drove back toward the city, leaving the silence of the field unbroken. Nature has a way of covering the scars of the land. And as the sun began to set on that Sunday evening, the tall grass hid the secret of what had happened. But the earth remembers. And while the killers returned to the noise and lights of Dallas, believing they had buried the truth along with the victims, they had underestimated the power of the silence they left behind. The watch was ticking on a different wrist. The car was driving down different streets, but the story was not over. It was merely waiting for the inevitable unraveling that comes when the natural order has been disturbed. The hayfield was quiet, but it was a loud, demanding quiet, the kind that does not let a city sleep. It happened in a place of commerce and routine. A furniture store where the scent of wood polish and new fabric usually signaled the comfort of home. Sherry Welch was 25 years old. She was a woman who had once walked across stages as a beauty queen, a person whose life was defined by grace and the promise of a bright future. She was working, living her life, unaware that the shadow from the alleyway had returned. When she was found, the scene bore the same chaotic signature as the one left in the Lawrence home. 30 wounds, a brutality that spoke of a deep, chaotic anger. The police realized quickly that the shadow had a name, and that name was the same one they had let go. This time, however, the science was ready to speak. The bloody palm print, which had sat silent in the evidence locker since the night at the Lawrence home, was finally matched. The patterns of the hand were undeniable. In the case of Sherry Welch, the evidence was even more personal. Dental impressions were taken, a clinical procedure that would match the marks left on her body to the man who had drifted through the town like a ghost. The forensic lock had finally clicked into place. But justice in Texas is rarely a short journey. Due to the intense fear that had gripped the community, the trial could not be held in the town where the memories were so fresh. And so, the proceedings were moved. We travel now across the vast, stretching landscape of Texas, covering 660 miles to Corpus Christi. Imagine that drive. The flat brown horizons of the Panhandle slowly giving way to the humid air of the coast. The miles rolling by, hour after hour, a physical representation of the distance between the crime and the consequence. Later, the venue would change again. Moving to El Paso, another corner of the state, another courtroom where the air conditioning hummed against the desert heat. Through it all, J. Kelly Pinkerton seemed to savor the attention. A young man caught in the gaze of a state that wanted answers. But the courts were not swayed by his demeanor. The verdicts were delivered. The sentences were read. The date was set. Time moved forward, as it always does, turning the sharp edges of grief into the dull ache of memory. On May 15th, 1986, the journey that began in a dark alleyway came to its end. Pinkerton was 24 years old. In his final months, he had turned his eyes toward a different kind of judgment, converting to Islam. The anger that had fueled the violence of 1979 seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a strange, resolute calm. The execution chamber is a stark room. Stripped of the comforts of the world, it is a place of absolute finality. When the time came, just minutes past midnight, Pinkerton looked to his father, Gene. He did not speak of the violence. He did not speak of the furniture store or the alley. He spoke of peace. "Be strong for me," he said, his voice steady in the quiet room. "I want you to know I am at peace with myself and with my God." He recited a prayer, his words drifting into the sterile air, a final petition for forgiveness. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah. I return unto you." And then, a final simple connection to the man who stood watching him leave the world. "I love you, Dad." His father's response was equally quiet. "Goodbye, Jay." And then, there was silence. In the end, the anger faded into a quiet prayer, spoken in a room where the only sound was the clock ticking toward midnight. The families of Sarah Lawrence and Sherry Welch were left to find their own peace in the years that followed. If the shadow had never entered their lives, Sarah would be 66 years old today. Sherry would be 60. They would be grandmothers, mothers, women enjoying the simple pleasure of a quiet evening. Instead, they remain frozen in time, their stories told in the archives of a city that has long since moved on. The plains of Texas hold many stories, and as the years passed, the heat of the summer brought a different kind of silence to the town of Harker Heights. Bitterness is a heavy stone to carry. It weighs down the soul, anchoring it to moments that have long since passed, preventing the spirit from finding the buoyancy needed to drift away. In the heat of central Texas, where the sun bleaches the color from the wooden fences and the asphalt shimmers in the afternoon haze, time often feels like it is standing still. It was here, in the small community of Harker Heights, that a routine moment on a Monday evening would begin a long period of waiting. The date was August 7th, 1978. The air was thick and humid, the kind of weather that makes every movement feel slow and deliberate. Officer Carl Levin, a 31-year-old man doing his job, noticed a shadow moving inside a vacant house southeast of Killeen. It was a routine check, the kind police officers perform thousands of times without incident. There was no dramatic chase, no siren wailing in the distance. There was simply a question asked of a stranger, a sudden flash of violence, and then a permanent silence. Officer Levin's watch stopped that day. But for the man standing in the doorway, the clock was just beginning a much longer, slower countdown. The man was Thomas Andrew Barefoot. He was 37 years old, a figure who had spent much of his life drifting through the currents of the legal system. He was not a monster under the bed, but a man from Louisiana who had wandered through Oklahoma and New Mexico, leaving a trail of fractured laws and broken peace in his wake. He was a fugitive, yes, but more than that, he was a man running out of road. His journey ended 2 days later at a bus station in Houston. There is a specific kind of resignation found in a bus station, a place of transit where journeys are supposed to begin. But for Thomas Barefoot, it was where the movement finally stopped. He was returned to Bell County, and the wheels of justice began their slow, grinding turn. But it is not the trial we focus on tonight. It is the waiting. The routine of death row is a hypnotic cycle of lights on and lights off, a world measured not in years, but in the rhythmic clanging of steel doors and the shuffling of guards' boots. Barefoot was sent to the Ellis unit in Huntsville, a place of stone and iron. For most, this is the end of hope, but the human mind is a powerful sanctuary. As the years ticked by, Barefoot became convinced that a higher power was intervening in his fate. In 1980, a stay of execution arrived. Then again in 1981, and twice more in 1983. To the outside world, these were legal maneuvers, the bureaucratic machinery of appeals and motions. To Barefoot, sitting in his cell, they were divine signals. He told his fellow inmates that God was keeping him alive. He believed that the delays were not procedural, but providential. The waiting room of death row creates a strange relationship with time. Days bleed into nights. The seasons change outside the high windows, but inside, the air remains stagnant. Barefoot spent these years constructing a fortress of belief, telling reporters and friends that he would be back, that the walk to the chamber was not his final journey. But time, unlike hope, is finite. The final day arrived on October 30th, 1984. The routine of the prison shifted from the mundane to the ceremonial. The last meal is a ritual that attempts to bring a moment of domestic comfort to a starkly clinical process. Barefoot requested a meal that spoke of home, of warmth, and of texture. He was served soup with crackers, the steam rising gently from the bowl. There was chili with beans, a heavy grounding dish, steamed rice, seasoned mustard greens, and hot spiced beets provided a contrast of flavors, a reminder of the earth. And finally, a glass of iced tea, the condensation gathering on the outside of the glass, cool to the touch against the warmth of the Texas night. It was a meal of substance, eaten in a room where the only future was the next hour. As midnight approached, the illusion of another stay of execution faded. The belief that God would stop the clock was replaced by the reality of the gurney. But even then, Barefoot did not scream or fight. He spoke. His final words were not of fear, but of a lesson learned in the long silence of his cell. He spoke to the widow of Officer Levin, not with malice, but with a strange, somber advice. He urged her to drive the bitterness from her heart. He spoke of bitterness as a weight, one that he was finally setting down before he left. I hope that one day we can look back on the evil that we're doing right now, like the witches we burned at the stake, he said, his voice steady. I forgive them all. He coughed once, and then the silence returned. He was a man who had spent a lifetime running and 6 years waiting, only to find that the destination was exactly where it had always been. Bitterness is a heavy stone to carry, and sometimes it is the innocent who are forced to carry it the furthest. Bitterness is a heavy stone to carry, often weighing down the soul long before the body comes to rest. But love, in its purest form, is light. It is a buoyancy that can lift a spirit even in the darkest of moments. A sanctuary that remains standing when the walls of the world begin to crumble. Tonight, we traveled to a place where that sanctuary was built not of stone and mortar, but of music and faith. It was the summer of 1977 in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. The heat of June had settled over the city, a thick, humid blanket that slowed the pace of life and turned the afternoon air into a shimmering haze. On Sunday, June 26th, the Second Mexican Baptist Church was filled with a specific kind of joy. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the stained glass windows, moving to the rhythm of a piano played by 36-year-old Elvira Guerrero. Elvira was a woman of deep faith and quiet strength. Her fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who found her voice in the music, filling the sanctuary with hymns that spoke of grace and redemption. Sitting nearby was Mario Alvarado Garza, a 28-year-old Mexican national who had found a new home and a new life in the community. That very morning, Mario had been baptized. The water had washed away his past, and the smile on Elvira's face promised him a future. They were deeply in love, planning a wedding that would unite their lives just as the church had united their spirits. After the service, the couple sought the quiet of a local park. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where families gather on picnic blankets and the sound of distant laughter drifts on the breeze. Elvira and Mario sat in her car, talking about the wedding, about the days to come, and about the simple, beautiful shape of a life built together. They were safe in their own world, insulated by the windows of the car and the glow of the morning ceremony. But the wind was changing. Two men, Michael Wayne Evans and Earl Stanley Smith, had walked to the park that afternoon. They were drifting through the city like smoke, looking for an opportunity, hunting for something that did not belong to them. Their arrival at the car was not an explosion of noise, but a sudden, chilling shift in the atmosphere. It was the shadow falling over the sun. Smith approached the window. In a moment that moved with the slow, inevitable slide of a nightmare, the sanctuary of the car was breached. There was no shouting match, no great struggle that drew the attention of the world. Just a quiet command, the flash of a weapon, and the turning of a key. Evans and Smith climbed into the vehicle, directing the couple to drive. The journey took them away from the safety of the park, away from the church where the piano notes still seemed to hang in the air, and into a remote area of South Dallas. The robbery was small, $40 in church donations and $12 from Mario's wallet, a total of $52. But the thieves wanted more than money. They wanted to erase the witnesses to their sin. It is here, in the tall grass of a hayfield, that the story shifts from a tragedy of violence to a testament of spirit. As the end approached, Elvira did not scream. She did not beg for her life in a way that gave power to the men who were taking it. Instead, she turned to the only source of strength she knew. According to the confession that would come later, Elvira took the hand of Michael Wayne Evans. She looked into his eyes, not with hatred, but with a profound and confusing pity. She began to pray. She asked God to forgive him. "God, help him," she whispered, holding the hand of the man who held the weapon. She was not fighting for her body. She was fighting for his soul. The violence that followed was brutal, a sharp and final silence that ended the prayers. But the image remains, a woman of faith in her final moments, choosing to comfort her killer rather than curse him. Evans and Smith covered the bodies with bushes and leaves, hiding their crime beneath the debris of the field. They walked away with a watch and a few dollars, leaving the hayfield to the insects and the heat. Nature began to reclaim the scene almost immediately. The wind rustled the dry grass, and the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. Even in the face of the end, her instinct was not to fight, but to forgive, a grace that would outlive the violence of that afternoon. The leaves covered the silence, but the rain would soon wash away the secrets hidden in the city. The silence of the hayfield was broken 4 days later. It was not the wind that disturbed the peace, but the necessary intrusion of discovery. Investigators moved through the tall grass, reading the ground for the story it had been forced to hold. Amidst the natural debris of the field, they found a small, manufactured object that did not belong. It was a cylinder rod, the metal pin used to eject bullets from a .22 caliber revolver. A tiny piece of steel, cold and hard, resting in the dirt. It was a silent witness, a mechanical breadcrumb left behind in the haste of the afternoon. The summer heat continued to press down on Dallas as the calendar turned to July. On the 11th day of the month, the rhythm of the city was interrupted by a moment of recognition. A relative of Elvira, navigating the traffic of the city, spotted a familiar vehicle. It was her car, moving through the streets, guided by hands that did not own it. The events that followed unfolded with the inevitability of a clock striking the hour. The pursuit was not a chaotic blur, but a procession of turning wheels and flashing lights cutting through the summer haze. The car wove through the streets, eventually coming to a halt near an apartment complex. The driver, Michael Wayne Evans, left the vehicle, disappearing into the shadows of a building that looked like any other. It was a place of domestic routine, where neighbors lived their lives, unaware of the history parked outside. Inside the apartment, the air was still. Police entered a space that felt lived in, a place of ordinary habits. In the bedroom, a dresser stood against the wall, holding the folded clothes of a daily life. But inside a drawer, hidden among the fabric, lay the snub-nosed revolver. It was known as a Saturday night special. The investigators noted a crucial detail. The ejector rod was missing. The piece of metal found in the field 4 days earlier had found its home. The puzzle was locking together, piece by piece, driven by the cold logic of evidence. When the questions finally came, the answers followed. Evans spoke of the event with a detachment that seemed to lower the temperature of the room. He offered a confession, but the words he chose were a watered-down reflection of the reality. He described the injuries he inflicted on Elvira as if they were minor details, speaking of cutting her eyes to stop her from talking. It was a clinical description of a tragedy, spoken by a man who had not yet comprehended the weight of his actions. But the confession was recorded. The words were set down in ink, becoming part of the permanent record, a testament to a Sunday afternoon that had gone terribly wrong. Time moves differently in the courtroom than it does in the field. The years drifted by, turning the pages of the calendar from the 70s into the 80s. The legal process moved with a slow, grinding certainty. Appeals were filed and denied stays were granted and lifted. The seasons turned over and over until it was December of 1986. The end of the road had arrived for Michael Wayne Evans. In those final moments, the detachment he had shown years earlier began to fade. The reality of the end brought a different kind of clarity. Tears filled his eyes as he lay on the gurney, the ceiling of the chamber the last horizon he would see. He spoke not of anger, but of a quiet sorrow. "I don't hold nothing against no one," he said softly. "I want to say I'm sorry for the things I've done, and I hope I'm forgiven." It was a final plea for peace in a room where the only sound was the hum of the lights. He was pronounced dead shortly after midnight, the time when one day surrenders to the next. His partner, Earl Stanley Smith, remained behind. He was sentenced to life, destined to watch the decades pass from behind the walls of the O.B. Ellis unit in Huntsville. For him, time would not stop. It would simply stretch out, a long, flat line of days turning into years. The watch was returned, the car was recovered, and the summer of 1977 faded into the archives of the city. From the heat of Dallas, we drift east, to the flowing waters of the St. Johns River, where the current hides what the surface cannot. Trust is a currency that is spent slowly, but it can be stolen in an instant. We often believe that the danger comes from the shadows of the alleyway, from the stranger we do not know. But sometimes the threat wears a familiar face. Sitting across the desk in a room filled with the scent of varnish and dust. In September of 1976, the air in Jacksonville, Florida, was heavy with humidity and the smell of the St. Johns River. It was a city of commerce and quiet neighborhoods, where the heat of the summer lingered well into the fall. James Stone, a 41-year-old business owner, spent his days surrounded by the mundane comforts of home. He owned Scott's Furniture Company, a place that smelled of sawdust and lemon polish, where families came to build their future living rooms. James was a man of routine, focused on the ledger and the inventory, unaware that the people closest to his business were drafting a different kind of plan. Working in his office was Jane Albert, his secretary. She was the gatekeeper, the one who handled the files and the phone calls. But outside the showroom floor, her life was entangled with two men who were drifting through the cracks of the city. Timothy Palms and Ronald Straight had moved into Jane's apartment earlier that month. They were men looking for easy money, and they saw James Stone not as an employee but as an opportunity. They proposed a simple arrangement. They would collect the debts owed to the furniture store by uncooperative customers. In exchange, they wanted 40% of the recovery. James Stone was a businessman, but he was not a violent man. When he realized their methods would involve force, he rejected the offer. He drew a line in the sand. He even offered Straight a small sum of money for new clothes, a gesture of goodwill to help a man get back on his feet. But goodwill is often lost on those who are only looking for a grievance. The rejection festered. In the cramped apartment, resentment began to grow like mold in the damp Florida heat. It was a calculated move, born of greed and a bruised ego. On Sunday, October 3rd, the plan moved from conversation to construction. Palms, Strait, and Albert visited a hardware store. They purchased lumber. They bought bags of heavy cement. They selected metal supports and boxes of screws. Back at the apartment, the afternoon was filled with the sounds of industry. The rhythmic rasp of a handsaw cutting through pine. The twist of a screwdriver biting into wood. The mixing of concrete. To a neighbor listening through the wall, it might have sounded like a home improvement project, a shelf being built, or perhaps a toy chest for a child. But they were building a container designed for a specific, dark purpose. The next morning, the trap was set. It was a Monday, the start of a new work week. Jane Albert, the trusted voice on the other end of the phone, called James Stone. She lured him out of the safety of the store and into her apartment. When he arrived, the familiar face of his secretary was the last thing he saw before the drifters emerged from the back room. The violence that followed was cold-hearted and prolonged, a stark contrast to the quiet domestic setting of the apartment. They placed him inside the box they had built with such care the day before. It was a heavy, wooden structure, weighted down with the cement they had mixed. They drove the box to the edge of the St. Johns River, where the water is dark and deep. They pushed it into the current. The splash was likely the only sound that broke the silence of the night. The river accepted the burden, the water closing over the wood, sealing the secret in the silt of the riverbed. It was a plan built on wood and cement, designed to sink beneath the weight of its own silence. The furniture store opened the next day, but the owner was gone, vanished into the flow of the river. But water, like time, has a way of returning what was taken. But water, like time, has a way of returning what was taken. While the river held its secret for a time, the architects of that silence were already moving, putting thousands of miles of asphalt between themselves and the dark water of Jacksonville. They drove west, chasing the setting sun toward California. It was a journey defined by the hum of tires on the interstate and the changing radio stations as they crossed the vast, open spaces of the American continent. In the car, the dynamic remained quiet. Jane Albert's 7-year-old daughter was with them, a small passenger on a fugitive run, likely watching the landscape shift from the humid swamps of the south to the flat, endless plains, and finally to the dry heat of the west. They were running from a memory. But memories have a way of traveling faster than any car. The road eventually ended in California. The law caught up with them, as it almost always does. The arrest was not entirely peaceful, but viewed from the distance a history. It appears as a brief flare of resistance before the inevitable. Shots were exchanged, Ronald Strait firing in a final, desperate attempt to keep the silence intact. But the chaos was short-lived. The handcuffs clicked shut, and the long drive back to Florida began. The legal system began its slow, grinding work. Jane Albert, the woman who had lured James Stone to the apartment, found a different path through the complex web of justice. In exchange for her testimony, she was granted immunity. She detailed the construction of the box, the lure, and the drive to the river. Her words became the evidence that would seal the fate of the two men. Timothy Palms faced the end of his journey on November 8th, 1984. The execution chamber in Stark, Florida, is a stark room, smelling of antiseptic and old dust, dominated by the heavy oak chair. But Palmies was not alone in those final moments. His family was present, watching through the glass partition. When asked for his final words, he did not speak of the furniture store or the river. He spoke of connection. "My family's love has been my strength," he said softly. "That's all. Goodbye." The hum of the lights overhead was the only response. Ronald Straight's turn came 2 years later, on May 20th, 1986. The setting was the same. The fluorescent lights buzzing with a low, constant drone, the leather straps worn smooth by time. But the atmosphere was starkly different. There